Hello everyone, my name is Brietta Kearns and welcome to Romantic Rhythms of Rebirth, a digital project exploring the lives of 4 emerging student jazz musicians in lockdown. If lockdown did not exist, we would have an ensemble of 4 musicians physically playing together, performing on instruments such as the double bass, the steel drums, guitar, piano, electric bass, the list goes on. Because of these restrictions, however, this project has become entirely unique in its own right. We will introduce you to 4 musicians, 2 composers, Rob Long and Hugh Levis, who have been commissioned to compose a piece of jazz music each, and 2 improvisers, Ayala Grunwald and Michael Reardon, who are to receive these compositions, work from them, and engage in a final performance where all 4 ensemble members will come together on a digital platform as one embodiment of creative work. Romantic Rhythms of Rebirth will be a collection of interviews, personal vlogs from each artist, and a final performance that engages you all to the heart of improvisation. Hugh Levis and Rob Long will document their compositional journey, how they came up with their pieces, the struggles and triumphs of being creative in an enclosed world. Michael Reardon and Ayala Grunwald will document their journey of receiving the pieces of music, working from the sounds of their fellow ensemble members, but in complete isolation. It is said in the jazz world that playing the wrong note in a piece forces the musician to unlock new potentials of sound. Sounds that may not have ever emerged had they played the right note. The unexpected change from one note to the next mirrors the change we feel as people, forced to improvise from one way of living to the next amidst a pandemic. The wrong note we feel in the present may in turn be a key to a greater right. We are all within our own cocoon of isolation. Let improvisation show us the way out. Now, this is a very broad question. You're free to take it any which way you want, but what does music mean to you? Just whatever, yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? I mean, for me now, it's what I've always liked about it is just the fact that it's such a fundamentally enjoyable thing. It's something that pretty much everybody likes. Anytime that someone says they don't like music, they get a few raised eyebrows quite often. So
yeah, it's very. I don't want to say that the point of it is to be expressive, because that's just my take on it. But a little bit like you said, music is so subjective, I guess, to so many different people, just in terms of things like genre and aesthetic. And even as a guitar player, I'm always fascinated by just the way that people do kind of simple techniques like bends and the way that they move around the instrument, because it's so personal to everyone, and it's near impossible to sound and think the same as anyone. And that's kind of the beauty of it. And I think also the beauty of getting to play with other people in a past life.
Like, I guess in a very simple way, it's just like a nice way to spend time. But in a bigger picture sense, it's depending on the music, but I find it very fulfilling in a kind of a philosophical or say spiritual way or whatever, that you like, especially with regards to jazz music, you're learning a lot about yourself as a person in the sort of whatever you call it, chasm of playing music that is separate from the rest of the world.
Yeah, for myself, music would well, it's pretty much integral, to my life, in that I always have or am listening or in my head or whatever music on all the time. There's not one point where there's any kind of silence, really. And that kind of thing about community and how very much, music is a shared experience pretty much always, obviously in these times it's being translated on virtual platforms, which is what this project celebrates. So yeah, I guess it's about sharing with other people and also your own kind of well-being for yourself is what music would mean, I guess.
God, I just look at the next question there. I sound really, I don't know, like I'm on something. But I said that I like to see improvisation as a kind of manifestation of all of your inspiration. So like, for example, when I be improvising, I, go off and it's like kind of anything is possible. It's just like I kind of float away, and like even if I make a mistake, I go with it. If you were to explain to someone what improvisation is in jazz music, particularly, we're kind of honing in on jazz now, what would you say, what's improvisation? If I didn't know it, let's say, if you could describe it to me.
Well, I guess the goal definitely for it, in my opinion, is like when you hear something in your head, it comes out.
And it's more obviously you have some kind of idea of where you want to go, because there's a track and a pattern, a structure to the piece that you're improvising on. So you have an idea of how you're structuring your improvisation. But for myself, it's mainly not necessarily coming from me so much as it's coming from what's being played, what I'm hearing around me, and that's where kind of the conversation arises, I guess.
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm gonna give a disappointingly short answer here, but I think it's just as simple as, making it up as you go along when and then as a result of that, it's a really great form of music because it's about as expressive as you can get, really, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
With improvisation, as opposed to composition, you oftentimes don't know what you're going to play, and you'll stumble upon stuff that you'll oftentimes like, without necessarily knowing that you're going to play it in the moment. And I think people, especially with jazz and stuff, people can kind of take a reductionist view of the whole thing, where they learn their scales and they learn the sort of form of a tune, and then they're thinking about it kind of theoretically, and that's a really handy framework to have. But I feel like the actual, bread and butter of jazz improvisation is kind of surprising yourself too, and not really being in your comfort zone. I think that's where it gets fun.
Yeah, and going off that, I suppose the foundation of this project basically is to try and use improvisation as a philosophy, as a way of thinking where you're like, oh God, I played the wrong note, but sure, we're just going to keep repeating it and we'll be taken off somewhere else, and just kind of being spontaneous. How we can like apply that as like a philosophy during this time where literally everything's been taken away, and it's like we've no choice but to go with it, and something better will come out of it. So I suppose, would you think that that's a good way of thinking and kind of using music as a philosophy, I suppose, of coping with things being thrown at us like this lockdown, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of I think that makes sense actually, because if you, I mean, as Rob's saying actually, that with improvisation, that being out of your comfort zone is quite often where it gets fun. And I think that's a similar point in that when you're being pushed to do something, quite often is when you, even just for composition, let's say, it's quite often where you come up with your like most interesting ideas that you just wouldn't have thought of otherwise. Like
that, it's not even something that you necessarily prepare for in the best of cases. It just sort of pours out of you. And so I spent a lot of time just picking up the guitar and seeing what came out when I went to it. It's a bit like daydreaming, if that makes sense, as opposed to pre-planning something and trying to get from A to B that way.
Like, you don't know what's going to come at you, but you're trying to be as ready to deal with anything as you can be.
Say COVID is a weird thing. I mean, I'm sure that's an understatement of the year. Like, but in that it's, as much as it's kind of cancels out any notion of time. It also forces a structure, especially, I suppose, as students and young musicians. That kind of combination makes for a very difficult routine that needs to be established, but at the same time, nothing is defined. So it's pretty much a long improvisation where you don't know is going to end or how it's going to end. Just have to kind of go with it, I guess.
I suppose I have one final question, and it relates to you being a musician, an emerging artist. I suppose you would say established in your own right, but in terms of your students, you're coming out into the world. How does it feel as an artist coming out into such a weird lockdown type of environment? Because musicians are like, oh, I got gigs and all. How does it feel to be coming out into a weird climate?
Oh, it's weird. Like on the one hand, lost so much money, because a lot of musicians didn't have proper employment, didn't get the COVID payment, but lost gigs after gigs after, like all the weekly stuff that adds up.
I feel like this will probably tailor a greater appreciation for live music. Now, I know this is quite specific to Ireland because Ireland has such a culture of live music in pubs, whether it be trad or whatever else kind of thing. But I suppose for myself, in terms of as a musician, how I feel coming out of this kind of lockdown situation, well, coming out, not yet, but this lockdown situation, I'd say kind of one of the silver linings of this is that I'm way more technically prepared coming out of this. So in terms of having to navigate recording equipment and editing, audio, visual, software equipment and whatnot, I'd feel way more prepared and rehearsed in this just because it's become a necessity to do that during COVID times. Yeah.
Terrifying. It's a lot.
Yeah, I would agree with Rob there. Like, this certainly wasn't the plan. This chord progression, and I was improvising over it to come up with a melody, and it was something along the lines of this, right? And, I like that quite a bit, but I was finding it a bit difficult to get a whole lot of material from that. I ended up, as the piece was coming along, I just felt like it was getting a bit repetitive and there just wasn't too much substance to the composition. So I actually changed it up for another composition, which I've also had going, because most musicians, if they they usually have a few compositions going at any given time, and I've actually changed my mind, and now I'm going to go with this one, and I'll just play the chord progression first. And it's really I really like the progression, and it changes keys and stuff like that, but it's quite nice, and it goes like this. Hey everybody, this is my final vlog, and today I'm going to be showing you how I compose my bass lines. It goes like this. So that's that.
Hello, I'm Michael. I'm a bass player. I'm just about to record the tracks for the UCC Out of Orbit Festival. So what I'm going to do now is just set up everything, and then we'll have a listen to what we've got and talk again then.
Nice one. Right. 2, 2, 3, 4. So I'm about to record Rob's tune. I have listened to it already because we had to do some pitch correction between different instruments.
Hi, my name is Natalie Thompson-Grunwald. I'm a Franco-Trinbagonian pianist and musician, and I'm playing steel pans for Brietta Kieran's Romantic Rhythms of Rebirth in the Orbit Festival 2021. So this is basically the end of my day. Just giving you a bit quick rundown. Finished studying. That's kind of, it's Monday, so 8 to 7 base. Well, what time is it? 7. Yeah, 7 studying. Oh god. And then a bit of practice. So I'm right in front of my tenor pan now, as you see. I've got my double second over there. Ignore that mess. It's my desk. So I'll start with a few scales. A bit. It's with one hand. It's absolutely not great. Bit half hour, an hour of practicing, improvising, and whatnot. And then that's my day done. There we go.
So to just illustrate a little bit of what's going on here, if we take the guitar in dad-gad tuning with the capo basically anywhere, then this is going to be your root for both the major and minor. But typically if we were playing trad, we might play in a kind of a major modal tuning. Because we're not necessarily thinking in major for this piece, we're leaning far more towards the kind of bluesy, for example. So rather than this, it kind of helps to think a little bit like a banjo player or a blues musician, where you're adding in all these blue notes. And so the general melody is a whole lot of improvisations with the capo down 2 frets in a sort of a minor position. So a little bit of chromaticism, 2 harmonics, and then back. And we have a slide and then a hammer on, so you don't actually pluck this note as such. Harmonics there ending the phrase, and the second time around we have a little bit more chromaticism to take us into the next section. We have and a thump there, and all I'm doing is I'm taking the left hand, it's not really in frame, but taking the left hand and pulling off with the left hand, so keeping the right just where it is, and you can make that sound independently. So your sort of improvisation section is all based around rolling triplets, and to do these I'll usually anchor my pinky, as you can see in the frame, just on the top of the guitar somewhere, and roll primarily with the thumb, the index, and the middle. So getting that up to speed can be a bit of a challenge. It's definitely one of the more difficult bits of the piece. So it starts off with a very simple melody line. And the trick is obviously to add your triplets around there. And so on and so forth. And then as the piece goes on, basically we're taking chord positions, so something like a minor, a 1 minor. A little bit more chromaticism. And then there's kind of a falling chromatic chord sequence. So that open 5th string there brings us right back to the 1. And then there's an interesting little variation on the 1 chord there, where rather than playing it as a minor, we're actually going. So. Little sequence there based around a very similar chord shape. Little ornament note there, and then into the next minor chunk of this section. And that bit there is probably the sort of minor climax of the piece, because right after that we jump back into a major shape. Whoops, there we are. And occasionally that lapses back down to minor, and it's very loopable. It's a nice way to close the piece and sort of demarcates the light at the end of the tunnel of the piece, because I was conscious that it was quite dark and probably needed something to juxtapose all that at the end, and it felt cathartic to put it in, to be quite frank.
Okay, so the first question, I mean, I know that we thought that it would be done at it'd be very smooth and, done at a certain day, but obviously it's not. So the first question I had is, how are you after this process? But obviously it's sort of an ongoing process. So how are you finding this? Yeah. In all ways, throw it all out. Yeah.
I mean, I always, expected there to be 1 or 2 maybe minor hiccups along the way, but it ended up being, much more, I don't know, let's say extended,
What was it like, I suppose, improvising, when you're not even with each other in a physical room and you have to listen back to other, were you as inspired, or were you more because you're kind of enwrapped in the technicalities of it, was it a lot harder to kind of go with the flow, if you were in a physical space, let's say, if that made any sense? As in, obviously it's that lack of community, I suppose, and it's more difficult to be creative, would you say, because you're all separated? Yeah.
And I suppose the difficulty really is that, say, when you're playing in the same space as the person, people, whatnot, it's never going to be the same thing that they play. I mean, yeah, what melody and chords, that stays the same, but even the way it's played or improvisation, it's never going to be the exact same. And here you just have one track to have in your head while you're playing along. So I guess that's the difficulty, in that you're not playing with. That didn't make sense. You're not playing along and changing your part and improvising on your part alongside someone else who's also doing that. You're playing to a track, I think.
Yeah, I found it really difficult to keep improvisation as a part of the process, especially while doing the takes and stuff like that, because obviously when you play with people in a room, you almost immediately get to hear their reaction to what you've played, in the context of just reading the room and seeing how they react, or obviously in the context of what they play, and so not having that it almost makes you less confident in improvisation in your own pieces. So with a lot of the takes, I might vary just different sections of it, kind of just to keep me interested, so I could keep doing it. But as opposed to having another musician in the room who can kind of respond to it and kind of keep you in check, you've got to sort of rely on your own gut as to, you know, when to stop and cut it out and leave room for everyone else.
So I suppose then I'm trying to get into Jeremy Kyle. No, I suppose it was difficult for everyone to communicate through and collaborate through text messages and videos and like that whole digital world. Like, how did I mean? You can just like vent or whatever you want to do, but just I obviously just I suppose you can explore your difficulty in and sort of there's a frustration with collaborating with people on a digital platform because obviously there's limitations in terms of you can't really be free and you can't really improvise because it's all sort of performed and programmed. But yeah, what were your difficulties or frustrations when it came to collaborating with each other and with the music, I suppose, in a digital frame? Does that make sense?
Well, I guess, I mean, first off, we're lucky that we have the kind of technology that we do today that allows communication, interaction, even in these circumstances. I mean, like, I don't know, say the pandemic had happened, what, 20, 30 years ago, wouldn't have been the same thing. Like, so there's that, first of all, which I guess, if not, I mean, it both made it harder, but it also made it easier then, so to speak, because even if, you know, you're not doing this in person, you're not playing with a person and whatnot, you still have the possibility to just text them or whatever and get an update, get a clarification, whatever it is you need. Yeah.
There. And as is the nature of doing this digitally as well, as opposed to having one single like performance deadline where you jump on the stage and do it, you've got multiple deadlines to meet, and I felt anyway, there was a lot of like finality in terms of, you know, once you had sent off your piece, your scratch track or whatever it was, that's the impression then that everyone else has of the piece immediately, and it's kind of irrevocable. And I don't know, I suppose I almost missed being able to take a piece into a room of musicians and play it for them and have it kind of evolve from there, as opposed to the thing that I send them being more or less the final product.
It's just hard to communicate over the phone, like when like you don't know if someone's looking at their phone or whatever, and you might be trying to do something at the time, or it could even be like when deadlines started getting pushed that you don't know when something is going to happen, so you're kind of sitting around waiting, and you can't ask, but you might not get an answer immediately, and just kind of lack of communication stuff, like however information you get about the music is like affects how much you can do with it depending on how much you get to communicate with the others, you know.
Obviously then the next question is sort of in relation to jazz and the future of it, in terms of, like, I suppose pandemic life is finite, so it's obviously not going to last forever, please God. No, it won't. But as in, like, when we're able to get back, obviously this won't be something that people will do, or this can't, as you can't, that's sort of the answer we have to come out with. You can't improvise digitally and passing it from one to the next because it's not actually improvisation, I suppose. Is that what you think? Because it's very planned and set, and it has to be, or things won't get done, because that's the restrictions of the digital world, is that you can't just be like, oh, you know, pick up on that there, or kind of feel the vibes, you know. I don't know if that made sense, but yeah, no, is that what you think, that like this couldn't be really possible to stay as a medium on a digital platform?
I mean, I don't know about that. Yeah, it's difficult, obviously. But I'd say what this has done then is it's opened up. Before, if you were having a performance or gig or something, it had to be people who were in the country. And I suppose what this has done is that it's kind of opened up the possibilities of who you can play with, in that you can, I don't know, practice, like call up someone and start practicing live, obviously dependent on a lot of digital things and whatnot. But it has kind of opened up that scope, which I think isn't a bad thing.
I've seen seen a bunch of recordings of people trying to play jazz online where it doesn't really work. And even if it's arranged, like people aren't, if there's a horn section, they're not hitting all the notes at the same time or whatever. But then there is an album as well, I think, by Chad Lefkowitz Brown, I think is his name. He did a big band album in lockdown where it just sounds like a big band in a room recorded really well, like better than most big bands. All the improvising sounds legit. All the horn sections, are really in time with each other. It sounds rehearsed, So,
Fair play to Chaz anyway. He got the job done well.
yeah.
God, I'll have to get some tips. I suppose I have one final question then. Obviously, as we were saying, like improvisation isn't as authentically, it's not able to be as authentic as it could be if it was in a physical space, so people just kind of tuning in the moment. But I think as a philosophy, just coming from my own thinking as well, and what this sort of is rooted in, is we've definitely all had to be open to whatever came out, as in we couldn't necessarily be like, this is what we have to do, because there's many times I sent you text like, this is it, and it had to change and constantly change. But it's more so about just going with it, as opposed, like, as in, say, with improvisation, as I've said, like if you play the wrong note or you're like, oh God, that was, just kind of keep going with it and you don't know where you're going to end up. So do you think that, you've had to kind of adapt the same philosophy, as opposed to maybe not necessarily playing improvisation, but you kind of had to just kind of be open to whatever came out, even if it's the wrong thing, just to sort of go with it, because that's the only way that things are actually going to evolve. If you have any thoughts.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, that the entire project was definitely a great experience in that applying that musically then digitally, but just in general, which I think that's where your question is headed. Yeah, I mean, we're all students. Obviously, this hasn't been the ideal year for either of us. I think Michael's a first year, or I don't know if I'm wrong here. Rob and Hugh are in their third years. I'm a final year. Obviously, it's not ideal, and that's basically what everyone has kind of had to learn to do, is to just go with it, and if it works, it works. If it doesn't, well, it'll settle somewhere along the way, kind of thing.
Yeah, similar sentiments here. Like, there was, I think the project as a whole is just kind of like a practice of how well you could go with the flow, and how, no matter how badly things messed up, still kind of finding a way to kind of make it all work. And I suppose the best way to describe it is none of it went according to plan, certainly on my end anyway. But you just had to make do it how it went. So yeah.
I feel like the last year or so has been one continuous exercise in improvisation anyway. But I would really agree with what Hugh said about having an almost obligation to re-record a mistake, because you know that you can, and you know that you can do as many takes as you like. But similarly, usually if I'm playing a set piece that someone else has written and I'm trying to record it and I make a mistake, I'll pretty much immediately stop the tape because I'm wasting my time otherwise. But with regards to this, because improvisation was still like the key ethos that we were trying to hone in on, if I was doing a take and went off track or did something unexpected, either in the moment or unintentionally, I did kind of feel an obligation to keep playing and like see where that led me. I felt that was really interesting, just to stop viewing that sort of thing as a mistake, and more like I don't know, to quote Bob Ross, a happy little accident.